At a 1995 campaign rally, Ross Perot interrupts TUPAC. "You kids don't understand what real leadership requires. You just complain about everything." The billionaire presidential candidate just lectured hip-hop royalty about politics in front of thousands of voters. What happens next surprises everyone. TUPAC's calm, intelligent response doesn't just educate Perot about youth engagement. It reveals something about authenticity, leadership, and real change that transforms how the campaign approaches young voters. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to watch until the very end. What Ross Perot admits about young leadership in the final moments will completely change how you think about politics and generational wisdom forever. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. We share these powerful stories regularly. Now let's see how TUPAC transformed a presidential campaign. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Dallas, Texas, September 23, 1995. The Will Rogers Memorial Center, where Ross Perot has gathered 4,000 supporters for what might be his final push toward a third-party presidential campaign that could reshape American politics forever. Where the billionaire businessman turned political outsider commands an audience hungry for alternatives to traditional Democrat-Republican establishments that have failed to solve America's most pressing problems. This massive arena, normally reserved for rodeos and livestock shows, has been transformed into a political battleground where Perot's populist message resonates with voters disillusioned by Washington politics and corporate influence that corrupts democratic processes. The crowd represents Middle America in all its frustrated glory: small business owners crushed by regulations and taxes, factory workers whose jobs disappeared to foreign countries, retirees watching their savings evaporate through inflation and government mismanagement, suburban families struggling with mortgage payments, while politicians argue about issues that seem disconnected from daily survival. These are Ross Perot's people, Americans who work hard and play by rules that keep changing to benefit wealthy elites and political insiders who manipulate systems for personal advantage rather than national progress. Perot himself stands at the podium like a general addressing troops before decisive battle, wearing his signature business suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but somehow makes him seem more authentic than politicians who dress down to appear relatable while maintaining lifestyles that separate them from ordinary Americans. At 65 years old, he's built a billion-dollar fortune through computer services and business acumen that politicians lack, proving that private sector success translates into governmental effectiveness better than law degrees and political connections that create problems instead of solving them. This is Ross Perot's moment, his opportunity to convince Americans that outsider perspective and business experience can fix problems that career politicians have made worse through decades of partisan warfare and special interest corruption. His message resonates because it's simple and direct. America needs leaders who understand how things actually work instead of how they're supposed to work according to political theory and academic analysis that ignores practical reality and common-sense solutions. The rally was designed to showcase Perot's connection with young voters, to demonstrate that his campaign transcends generational boundaries and appeals to Americans of all ages who share frustration with political establishments that serve themselves rather than constituents who elect them. Campaign organizers invited several prominent young figures to appear alongside Perot, including musicians and artists and activists who could validate his message among demographics that traditionally ignore third-party candidates and accept limited choices between Democrat and Republican options that offer false alternatives rather than real change. TUPAC Shakur, 24 years old, sits in the VIP section wearing simple black slacks and white dress shirt that makes him look more like young business executive than controversial rapper whose music terrifies suburban parents and conservative politicians who blame hip-hop culture for moral decay and social problems that existed long before rap music gave voice to communities that traditional politics ignores. His presence at Perot rally represents something unprecedented in American politics: hip-hop culture engaging with third-party movement that challenges two-party system and corporate influence that both parties serve, despite rhetorical differences designed to maintain illusion of meaningful choice. Campaign staff positioned TUPAC prominently to signal Perot's appeal among young urban voters, to demonstrate that populist message transcends racial and cultural boundaries that divide Americans artificially, while economic elites profit from social fragmentation that prevents unified opposition to policies that serve wealthy interests rather than national welfare. The visual symbolism is intentional. Billionaire businessman and hip-hop artist united by shared recognition that current political system fails ordinary Americans, regardless of background or ideology. But something unexpected happens during Perot's speech about generational responsibility and leadership development, something that transforms planned campaign event into unscripted confrontation about youth engagement and political authenticity. Perot begins discussing young Americans with mixture of condescension and concern that reflects generational misunderstanding common among successful older Americans who achieved prosperity during economic expansion that no longer exists for their children and grandchildren. His remarks start innocuously enough, acknowledging energy and idealism of young people while questioning their understanding of practical governance and economic reality that requires compromise and gradual change rather than revolutionary transformation that young activists demand. But Perot's tone shifts as he warms to his theme, adopting paternal authority that suggests young Americans lack wisdom and experience necessary for serious political participation, that their criticism of existing systems reflects immaturity rather than legitimate grievances about policies that have failed their generation. The crowd responds positively to Perot's generational analysis because most attendees are older Americans who share his frustration with young people who seem entitled and unrealistic about political possibilities, who demand immediate solutions to problems that require patient work and incremental progress through established channels rather than disruptive protests and radical demands that threaten stability and order that older Americans worked decades to achieve. But then Perot makes a mistake that transforms supportive rally into confrontational dialogue, that turns planned campaign event into educational opportunity about leadership and authenticity and what real change actually requires in democratic society. He notices TUPAC in the VIP section and decides to use him as example of generational differences, pointing directly at him while continuing his remarks about young American political engagement and leadership development. "You kids don't understand what real leadership requires," Perot says, his voice carrying across arena through sound system that amplifies every word to 4,000 supporters and media representatives covering what was supposed to be routine campaign event. "You just complain about everything without offering practical solutions or understanding how change actually happens in political system that requires compromise and patience rather than demands and protests." The arena goes completely silent as 4,000 people turn to look at TUPAC, who sits calmly in his chair without visible reaction to being singled out by presidential candidate in front of massive crowd and national media coverage. Campaign staff freeze in panic because this wasn't scripted, wasn't planned, wasn't supposed to happen during carefully choreographed event designed to showcase Perot's appeal rather than create controversy that could damage his campaign among voters who might be sympathetic to hip-hop culture and young urban concerns. But Perot continues, emboldened by crowd response and his own conviction about generational differences that separate older Americans who built current prosperity from younger Americans who criticize achievements they didn't contribute to creating. "Real leadership means taking responsibility instead of blaming others," he explains, "building solutions instead of pointing out problems, working within systems instead of trying to tear them down through protest and complaint." Media representatives sense unexpected drama unfolding and focus cameras on TUPAC, who remains composed despite being publicly challenged by presidential candidate in front of hostile crowd that shares Perot's skepticism about young political engagement and hip-hop cultural influence. This is exactly the kind of moment that can define campaigns, that gets replayed on news programs, and analyzed by political commentators and remembered long after election results are forgotten. Tupac stands slowly, not aggressively, but deliberately, commanding attention through presence rather than volume or dramatic gesture. Campaign organizers panic because they don't know what he might say, don't know whether he'll create controversy that damages Perot's carefully constructed image as reasonable alternative to partisan politicians who engage in personal attacks rather than substantive policy discussions. But when Tupac speaks, his voice carries no anger or defensiveness, just calm intelligence that surprises audience expecting emotional reaction or inflammatory rhetoric that confirms stereotypes about hip-hop culture and young urban political engagement. He asks Perot a simple question that reframes entire conversation, that transforms accusation into dialogue, that forces examination of assumptions about leadership and change, and what qualifies someone to participate in democratic discourse. He asks when Perot last lived paycheck to paycheck, when he last worried about paying rent or buying groceries or affording health care that his employees take for granted because billion-dollar success insulated him from economic realities that younger Americans face daily. When he last experienced unemployment or discrimination or systemic barriers that prevent individual effort from translating into prosperity that previous generations achieved through similar work but different economic conditions. The question hits Arena like intellectual lightning because it's not defensive but proactive, not personal attack but policy inquiry, not complaint but analysis of different perspectives based on different experiences that shape different understandings of what leadership means and what change requires in society where economic opportunity has become concentrated among wealthy elites while ordinary Americans struggle despite working harder than previous generations. Tupac continues with voice that fills Arena without shouting, that commands attention through substance rather than volume, that demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership that Perot claims young Americans lack. He explains that his generation inherited problems created by previous generations, environmental damage, and economic inequality, and political corruption that older Americans created or tolerated while building personal prosperity that younger Americans can't achieve through same methods because economic conditions have fundamentally changed. His generation doesn't just complain, Tupac explains, they organize and vote and create alternative institutions when existing institutions fail to address their concerns. They use art and music and media to educate communities and raise consciousness about issues that traditional politics ignores, to give voice to people who have been excluded from political processes that serve wealthy interests rather than democratic principles that America claims to represent. The arena remains silent throughout Tupac's response, which lasts nearly 8 minutes without interruption from Perot or crowd reaction that might disrupt his analysis of generational differences and leadership requirements and what real change actually means in democratic society. Even Perot listens without defending himself or attacking Tupac's analysis, recognizing that he's hearing perspective he's never considered from source. He never expected to provide sophisticated political commentary. Tupac's final point hits hardest because it challenges Perot's central campaign theme about outsider perspective and business experience qualifying someone for political leadership. He asks whether leadership means preserving systems that benefit older Americans or changing systems that fail younger Americans, whether experience means understanding how things work or understanding how things could work better, whether success means personal achievement or collective progress that includes people who haven't had same opportunities. Perot realizes he's not debating typical young activist who argues from ideology without practical understanding. He's engaging with someone who understands political processes and economic systems, someone whose criticism is based on analysis rather than emotion, someone whose perspective challenges assumptions that Perot built his campaign on, without examining whether those assumptions serve all Americans or just Americans like himself who achieved success under conditions that no longer exist. The conversation that follows lasts 35 minutes and transforms both men's understanding of generational differences, political engagement and what authentic leadership actually requires in diverse democracy, where different communities face different challenges that require different solutions rather than one-size-fits-all approaches that ignore complexity of modern American society. Perot acknowledges that his success was built partly on opportunities that no longer exist for younger Americans, that economic conditions have changed in ways that make individual effort less likely to translate into prosperity that his generation achieved. He recognizes that young criticism of existing systems might be based on legitimate analysis rather than generational entitlement, that calls for change might reflect realistic assessment of policy failures rather than unrealistic expectations about political possibilities. TUPAC learns about complexity of political processes and compromise requirements that make immediate change difficult, even when change is necessary and overdue. He gains appreciation for experience and institutional knowledge, while maintaining that experience without empathy can become obstacle to progress rather than foundation for effective governance. After the rally ends, Perot privately tells his campaign staff that conversation with TUPAC changed his perspective on young voters and political engagement, that his campaign needs to listen to younger voices rather than dismissing their concerns as generational immaturity. He doesn't abandon his core message about outsider leadership, but he acknowledges that outsider perspective should include voices from outside his own demographic and economic background. 3 months later, Perot's campaign begins incorporating youth outreach programs and urban policy initiatives that reflect input from younger advisors, including several recommended by TUPAC. The changes don't save his campaign from ultimate defeat by traditional party candidates, but they demonstrate evolution in his understanding of leadership and change that survives his political failure and influences future third-party movements that recognize importance of cross-generational coalition building. Years later, political scientists study the Dallas rally as example of how unexpected encounters can transform campaign messaging and candidate perspectives, how authentic dialogue can bridge generational divides that usually separate American voters into competing demographic groups rather than unified constituencies seeking similar goals through different methods. September 23, 1995, at Dallas rally, a presidential candidate learned that real leadership requires listening to all generations, that authentic change includes voices from all communities, that political wisdom comes from experience combined with empathy rather than success isolated from struggle. The day Ross Perot lectured TUPAC about leadership became the day he discovered that leadership means learning from people who challenge your assumptions rather than dismissing them for lacking your experience.